Go ahead, the man said without looking up from his glass, his voice smooth but edged with quiet challenge. Tell me the difference between a Bordeaux and a Burgundy in French. The words didn't echo, but they landed hard enough to bend the air around the table, slicing clean through the low hum of expensive conversations and the soft clink of crystal under amber light. A few heads turned, not because of what was asked, but because of who it was asked to. Maya Brooks stood still for half a second, her hand resting lightly on the neck of a wine bottle that cost more than her weekly paycheck, her posture straight, her expression calm, the kind of calm that didn't come from confidence alone, but from control. The restaurant was the kind of place where deals were made before the appetizers arrived, where watches gleamed like silent trophies and laughter always sounded a little rehearsed, and at the center of it all sat Ethan Caldwell, a billionaire so known not just for his success, but for the way he studied people like they were problems waiting to be solved. He hadn't glanced at her when he spoke, hadn't offered the courtesy of eye contact, because in his world, people in uniforms didn't usually require it. Around him, his guests shifted subtly, some amused, some uncomfortable, most curious, because moments like this had a way of revealing more than anyone intended. Maya didn't rush to answer. She didn't fumble or apologize or shrink into the role they had already assigned her. Instead, she placed the bottle down with precise care, the label facing outward, her movements quiet but deliberate, as if the room itself had slowed to watch what she would do next. She had seen this before, not the exact question, not this exact table, but the pattern, the assumption wrapped in politeness, the test disguised as casual conversation, the quiet belief that she would either stumble or stay silent. And for a brief moment, the camera of the room, because every room like this had one, invisible but real, zoomed in on her, waiting for the expected outcome. Ethan finally looked up then, just slightly, not fully, just enough to catch her in his peripheral vision, the faintest hint of a smirk touching the corner of his mouth as if he had already written the ending to this interaction. What he didn't know, what no one at that table could have known, was that Maya had spent years listening more than she spoke, learning more than she showed, carrying pieces of knowledge that never seemed to belong in places like this until moments like now forced them into the light. The air tightened, not with hostility, but with anticipation, the kind that makes even the smallest movement feel significant. And somewhere in the background, a server paused mid-step, sensing the shift without fully understanding it. Maya lifted her gaze, not sharply, not defiantly, but steadily, meeting the space just past Ethan's eyes, her voice when it came soft, measured, and unmistakably certain, not raised, not rushed, but clear enough to cut through the room without effort. And in that single breath before she spoke, something subtle but undeniable began to change, because this was no longer just a question about wine, and it was never really about wine to begin with. La difference, Maya began, her voice smooth and unhurried, is not just the region, but the philosophy behind the wine. And the moment the first word left her lips in fluent, precise French, the room shifted in a way no one could quite explain. It was not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, like a subtle crack forming in something people had assumed was solid. A man at the far end of the table lowered his glass halfway to his lips and forgot to finish the motion, while a woman seated beside him blinked twice, as if recalibrating what she thought she was hearing. Maya did not rush through her explanation. She let each word land cleanly, describing the soil, the grapes, the tradition with a clarity that did not feel rehearsed but lived, as though this knowledge had been carried quietly for years waiting for a moment exactly like this. Ethan Caldwell's smirk did not disappear immediately, but it paused, suspended in uncertainty, the kind that only appears when expectation begins to unravel. He leaned back slightly in his chair, not as a gesture of relaxation, but as if he needed a different angle to see what was unfolding in front of him. Maya finished her explanation without embellishment, without seeking approval, and without the slightest hint of performance, then gently reached for the bottle again, her posture returning to neutral as though nothing unusual had just occurred. For a brief second, no one spoke, and in that silence, the hierarchy of the room flickered, just enough to be felt. Then Ethan set his glass down with a soft, deliberate sound, the kind that usually signaled the start of something rather than the end. "Interesting," he said, this time looking directly at her, his tone no longer casual, but measured, analytical, as if he had just encountered a variable he had not accounted for. There was no applause, no acknowledgement from the others, only the quiet recalibration of perception, which in rooms like this carried more weight than any compliment. Maya nodded once, politely, and turned slightly as if to continue her duties, but she did not step away entirely, and that hesitation did not go unnoticed. Ethan watched her for a fraction longer than necessary, his mind moving quickly beneath a composed exterior, connecting patterns, reassessing assumptions, and most of all, deciding. Because the question he had asked had never been about wine, and her answer, while correct, had not satisfied what he was truly looking for. Around them, conversation slowly resumed, but it no longer held the same rhythm, as if the room itself had become aware that something had shifted beneath the surface. Ethan reached for his napkin, adjusted it with unnecessary precision, then spoke again, quieter this time, but with intent sharpened to a point. "Tell me," he said, "what would you do if a guest accused your colleague of making a mistake that you knew they did not make?" The question did not sound like a challenge to most of the table, just another hypothetical, another passing curiosity from a man who liked to explore scenarios. But Maya understood immediately that this was different. This was not about knowledge, not about memory or study, but about choice. She did not answer right away, and that pause, subtle and controlled, stretched just long enough to draw his full attention. Her eyes moved briefly toward another server across the room, then back, not in hesitation, but in recognition of something deeper than the question itself. Ethan did not interrupt, did not clarify, he simply watched, because now, for the first time that night, he was not testing her to confirm what he already believed, he was testing to discover what he did not yet know. The question did not float in the air the way the first one had. It settled, heavy and deliberate, like something placed exactly where it was meant to test balance rather than knowledge. And Maya felt the shift immediately, because this was no longer about what she knew. It was about what she would choose when knowing came with a cost. She kept her hands steady, fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, her posture unchanged, but her attention sharpened in a way that was almost invisible unless someone was looking for it. And Ethan was looking now, not casually, not out of curiosity, but with intent that cut deeper than before. Around them, the room pretended to return to normal, glasses lifted again, conversations resumed in low tones, but there was a thread of awareness running through it all, a quiet understanding that something was unfolding at this table that did not belong to the usual script. Maya let a single breath pass before answering, not as hesitation, but as acknowledgement of the weight behind the question, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm precision as before, but now there was something else beneath it, something grounded. "I would tell the truth," she said, simple, direct, without decoration, and for a moment, that answer seemed almost too easy, too expected, but she did not stop there. "Even if it costs me the tip, or the shift, or the job," she continued, her tone steady, not defiant, not emotional, just clear, as if she had already made peace with that reality long before this moment ever arrived. Ethan did not react right away, and that silence stretched differently this time, not with surprise, but with evaluation, as though he was measuring the distance between her words and something deeper he had not yet revealed. "Hey." Guest nearby shifted in his chair, glancing briefly toward another server across the room, a young man who had just been quietly correcting a place setting, unaware that he had become part of a hypothetical that no longer felt hypothetical at all. Maya noticed him too, not because she was searching for validation, but because her answer had not been abstract. It had been rooted in the reality of people like him, people who worked beside her, who relied on each other more than anyone at the table would ever fully understand. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlacing on the table, his gaze steady now, no longer detached, no longer distant. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, quieter, but sharper. "And if telling the truth puts you at odds with someone more powerful than you?" he asked, the words careful, almost surgical, as if he was narrowing the frame of the test to its core. Maya did not look away, and this time she did not pause as long, because the question had already been answered inside her long before he asked it. "Then I still tell it," she said, And there was no emphasis, no raised tone, just certainty, the kind that does not need reinforcement. For the first time that evening, something in Ethan's expression shifted in a way that could not be mistaken for calculation alone. It was not shock, not yet, but recognition, the early stage of realizing that the person in front of him was not fitting into any of the categories he had prepared. He sat back again, slower this time, his eyes remaining on her as if stepping away would mean losing clarity, and around them, the room continued its quiet performance of normalcy, unaware that the real conversation had already moved beyond what could be heard. Because what Maya had just done was not answer a question. She had revealed a principle, and principles, unlike knowledge, could not be tested with a single scenario, which meant this was not the end of the test. It was only the moment it became real. The air did not return to normal after her answer. It only pretended to, like a stage reset between acts while the real tension lingered just beneath the surface. And Ethan Caldwell knew it, because he had seen answers before, confident ones, rehearsed ones, even bold ones. But this was different. This was not performance. It was alignment, and alignment could not be faked under pressure. He reached for his glass again, but did not drink, turning it slightly between his fingers as though the motion itself helped him think. And for a brief moment, he looked away from Maya, not out of dismissal, but because something in his mind had shifted direction, moving past the simple test he had planned into something less predictable. Across the room, a quiet disruption began to form, subtle at first, easy to ignore if one chose to, but impossible to miss if one was paying attention, and Ethan had trained himself to notice patterns like that long before they became obvious. A voice, low but edged with irritation, came from a nearby table where a sharply dressed guest was gesturing toward the young server Maya had glanced at earlier, his tone controlled but clearly dissatisfied, the kind of dissatisfaction that did not need volume to carry weight. "This is not what I ordered," the man said, his words clipped, precise, directed not just at the plate in front of him but at the person who had delivered it. And the server froze for half a second, not because he did not know how to respond, but because he knew exactly how these moments usually ended. Maya saw it immediately, the slight tightening in his shoulders, the careful way he adjusted his stance, the quiet calculation of whether to apologize or explain, and more importantly, she recognized the truth behind the situation before a single word of defense could be spoken. Ethan did not intervene, did not signal, did not even shift in his chair, but his attention sharpened in a way that made everything else fade into the background. Because this was no longer hypothetical, this was the test moving from theory into reality. The manager approached quickly, his expression composed but alert, ready to smooth over whatever tension had begun to rise. And in spaces like this, smoothing over usually meant simplifying the story, choosing the version that kept the guest comfortable, even if it meant someone else absorbed the cost. The guest continued, now more certain, explaining that the order had been incorrect, that expectations had not been met, that details mattered, and with each word, the pressure shifted quietly toward the server, who nodded once, professionally, even though the truth was not on his side of the table. Maya did not wait for permission, and she did not move abruptly, because urgency without control often looked like disruption, and she understood the rules of this environment too well to break them carelessly. She stepped forward with measured precision, her presence calm but undeniable, her voice entering the conversation at just the right moment, not loud, not interrupting, but clear enough to redirect the flow without escalating it. "Sir," she said, her tone respectful but steady. The order was entered correctly, and the dish prepared matches what was requested. And there it was, the line drawn not with force, but with certainty, the kind that did not challenge authority directly, but refused to bend under it either. The manager's eyes flickered toward her, a brief flash of calculation passing between maintaining control and acknowledging truth, while the guest paused, not expecting resistance from someone he had not even fully registered moments ago. Ethan watched every second of it, not the words alone, but the way she stood, the way she chose her tone, the way she carried the weight of that statement without letting it become confrontation, and in that instant, the test he had designed revealed something far more valuable than he had anticipated, because Maya was not just answering questions anymore, she was living them, and in doing so, She was forcing the entire room to confront a reality it usually preferred to keep invisible. The moment did not explode. It tightened, pulling every gaze at that table toward a single point where expectation and reality no longer aligned. And for a brief second, no one spoke because no one was entirely sure who was supposed to speak next. The guest's expression shifted first, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that the script he had relied on was no longer holding. His confidence meeting. Resistance that did not look like defiance, but something far more unsettling, calm certainty. The manager stepped slightly forward, his posture still composed, but his eyes now moving between Maya and the guest, calculating the safest path through a situation that had quietly grown more complex than it appeared on the surface, because in places like this, truth was not always the priority, stability was. "Let me take care of this," the manager said, his voice smooth, practiced, designed to close the situation rather than explore it. And for a moment, it seemed like the usual resolution would take shape, the kind where discomfort is absorbed quietly and the evening continues uninterrupted. But Maya did not step back, and she did not raise her voice. She simply remained where she was, her presence steady, her position unchanged, and that stillness spoke louder than any argument could have, because it made retreat visible in a way that words never would. "The kitchen prepared exactly what was ordered," she added gently, not to challenge, but to clarify, her tone carrying no accusation, only fact, and that distinction mattered more than anyone at the table realized. The guest exhaled slowly, glancing down at the plate again, then back up, as though searching for an angle that would restore the balance he had expected, but the certainty in Maya's voice had already begun to shift that balance, not by force, but by precision. Ethan Caldwell watched without interruption, his gaze fixed not on the conflict itself, but on the way it unfolded, the choices within it, the discipline required to hold truth without turning it into confrontation. And for the first time that evening, there was no trace of assumption left in his expression, only attention. The manager hesitated for a fraction of a second longer, then made a decision, subtle but significant, turning back to the guest with a slightly adjusted tone, one that acknowledged the possibility that the issue might not be where it initially appeared. "Let us double-check the order together," he said, and with that, the direction of the moment changed, not dramatically, not publicly, but enough to shift responsibility back, toward clarity rather than convenience. The guest nodded once, slower now, his earlier certainty replaced with something quieter, something more cautious, and as the tension eased, it did not disappear, it transformed, settling into the kind of silence that follows a truth being recognized, even if not openly admitted. Maya stepped back then, not because she had been dismissed, but because her role in that moment had been fulfilled, her posture returning to neutral, her expression unchanged, as though nothing extraordinary had taken place, and that, more than anything, made it impossible to ignore. Around the room, conversation resumed again, but it carried a different tone now, less certain, more aware, as if something invisible had been revealed and could not be unseen. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, his mind no longer testing for skill, no longer probing for knowledge, but confronting something far more difficult to measure, because what Maya had demonstrated was not just intelligence, it was integrity under pressure, and integrity, once witnessed, had a way of demanding recognition whether one was ready to give it or not. The room did not return to what it had been before, because once a line had been drawn and held, even quietly, the space around it carried a different weight, and Ethan Caldwell felt that shift more clearly than anyone else at the table, not because he was more observant, but because he had been the one who set the test in motion. He did not speak immediately, and that silence was no longer passive. It was deliberate, a pause that signaled something was about to be acknowledged rather than ignored, and when he finally moved, it was subtle, just enough to draw attention without demanding it. He placed his glass down, not with emphasis, but with intention, and turned his full attention toward Maya, no longer from the corner of his vision, no longer as part of an experiment, but directly, as if the distance between them had just been recalculated. "That will be all for now," he said to the table, his voice calm, but carrying authority that did not need to be raised, and one by one, the others shifted, some nodding, some glancing at Maya with expressions that had changed in ways they did not fully understand, as if they had just witnessed something they were not used to seeing from someone they had not expected to notice. Maya gave a small nod, professional, composed, and began to step back, returning to the rhythm of the room. But Ethan was not finished, not yet, because the test he had designed had reached its conclusion, and what remained was something he had not planned for. "Miss Brooks," he said, and the use of her name landed differently than everything that had come before, not louder, not softer, but more precise, and she paused, turning back just enough to acknowledge without overstepping. There was no rush in her movement, no sign that she expected anything more than another request, another instruction, because in her world, recognition rarely followed moments like this, and expectation had long been replaced with discipline. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table, his posture no longer that of a man observing from a distance, but of someone stepping into the moment he had created. "I owe you an answer," he said, and for the first time that evening, there was no edge in his voice, no trace of challenge, only clarity. A few of the guests exchanged brief glances, sensing that the dynamic had shifted beyond the usual boundaries of service and status, but no one interrupted, because even without understanding fully, they knew this was not something to be diluted by commentary. Ethan held her gaze for a fraction longer, then continued, "I was not testing your knowledge, and I was not testing your skill," he said, each word measured, not dramatic, but grounded in something that had moved beyond assumption. Maya did not react outwardly, but something in her stillness sharpened, not in surprise, but in recognition that the moment had just changed direction again. "I was testing your judgment," he added, and the weight of that statement settled into the space between them, not as a revelation meant to impress, but as a truth meant to be understood. Around them, the room seemed to quiet once more, not because people stopped speaking, but because attention had narrowed, drawn toward a conclusion that was unfolding in real time. Ethan sat back slowly, his expression no longer guarded by confidence, but open in a way that suggested something had been recalibrated internally, something he had not anticipated needing to adjust. "And you did not just pass," he said, his voice steady. "You redefined the standard." The words did not echo, they did not demand reaction, but they carried a weight that settled deeply, because recognition, when it came without condition, had a way of cutting through everything that had come before it. Maya inclined her head slightly, not in acceptance of praise, but in acknowledgement of the moment, her composure unchanged, her presence still grounded in the same quiet discipline that had carried her through every second of the evening. And in that stillness, it became clear that whatever Ethan had been looking for when the night began, he had found something far more difficult to measure and far more impossible to ignore. The words did not fade when he finished speaking. They settled, steady and unshaken, like something that had found its place after being unspoken for far too long. And for a brief moment, no one at the table moved, because recognition at that level did not invite applause, it demanded reflection. Maya stood there, composed as ever, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture unchanged, but something deeper had shifted, not in how she carried herself, but in how the room now carried her, because the same presence that had once been invisible was now impossible to ignore. Ethan watched her carefully, not searching anymore, not testing, but understanding, and that distinction changed everything. He had spent years building systems that filtered people down to measurable traits, skills, outcomes, efficiency, but what stood in front of him now did not fit into any metric he had ever relied on, because integrity, when it revealed itself under pressure, refused to be simplified. A faint murmur returned to the room, conversations cautiously restarting, but they no longer carried the same confidence, as if everyone present had just been reminded that value did not always announce itself in the ways they were used to recognizing. Ethan exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, then leaned back in his chair, his gaze still fixed on Maya, as though stepping away from the moment too quickly would mean missing something essential. "How long have you been here?" he asked, his tone no longer probing, but genuinely curious, the kind of question that did not seek to evaluate, but to understand. Maya answered simply, "Just over a year," her voice steady, not offering more than what was asked, not because she was guarded, but because she had learned that in rooms like this, simplicity often carried more weight than explanation. Ethan nodded once, absorbing that, his mind already moving beyond the surface of the answer, because a year in this environment did not produce what he had just witnessed unless something had been building long before it. He studied her for a second longer, then asked, "And before that?" The question was softer, but it carried more depth, and Maya paused, not out of hesitation, but out of precision, choosing what to reveal, not to impress, but to remain aligned with the same honesty she had already demonstrated. "I studied business analytics," she said, her tone even, "finished my degree, applied to several firms." She did not elaborate, did not list names, did not frame it as loss or injustice. She simply stated it as fact, and somehow that made it more powerful than any detailed explanation could have been. Ethan's expression shifted again, more noticeably this time, not into surprise, but into recognition that connected something he had not expected to connect. "And none of them hired you," he said, not as a question, but as a realization forming in real time. Maya gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her gaze steady, not resentful, not defensive, just grounded in truth. "Not exactly," she replied, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only clarity. Around them, the few guests who were still listening felt the shift deepen, because the story was no longer confined to a single evening. It was extending into something larger, something that carried implications beyond the table. Ethan leaned forward again, slower now, his focus narrowing in a way that suggested the next words would not come from habit, but from decision. "Did you ever apply to Caldwell Dynamics?" he asked, and for the first time since the conversation began, the question did not test her, it tested him, because the answer, whatever it was, would not just reveal her past, it would reflect on his own. Maya held his gaze for a fraction longer than before, not to challenge, not to hesitate, but to confirm that this moment deserved the same honesty as every answer she had given so far, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm certainty that had defined every word she had said that night. "Yes," she said, and the simplicity of that single word landed heavier than anything else that had been spoken, because now the test had turned, and the direction of accountability had quietly, unmistakably reversed. The word did not echo, but it did not need to, because it landed with a precision that cut through every assumption still lingering in the room, and Ethan Caldwell felt it before he could process it, not as a shock, but as a realization unfolding faster than he could control. He did not look away, and that alone marked the difference between the man who had started this evening and the one now sitting across from Maya, because for the first time, avoidance would have been easier, but he chose not to take it. "When?" he asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of performance, as if each word required more intention than before. Maya did not rush her answer, not because she needed time, but because she understood that timing shaped meaning, and meaning mattered more than speed in moments like this. 2 years ago, she said, her tone even, her posture unchanged, her presence still grounded in the same calm discipline that had carried her through every part of the night. Around them, the room had begun to settle into a strange stillness, not silent, but aware, as if the energy had shifted from observation to recognition, and no one wanted to disrupt what was unfolding. Ethan nodded once, slowly, his mind already moving through records, processes, decisions made in rooms. Far removed from this one, decisions that had once felt efficient, rational, correct, but now seemed incomplete in ways he had never considered. "And what happened?" he asked, though part of him already understood the answer, because systems like his rarely made mistakes in isolation, they made them by design. Maya met his gaze without hesitation, not with accusation, not with expectation, but with the same clarity she had shown from the beginning. "I received a rejection email," she said, simple, direct, without embellishment, and that simplicity carried more weight than any detailed explanation ever could. Ethan exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that did not release tension so much as acknowledge it, and for a brief moment, he leaned back, his eyes drifting away, not to disengage, but to process, because what stood in front of him now was not just a person he had underestimated. It was a reflection of decisions he had never questioned deeply enough. He turned back to her, his expression no longer guarded by certainty, but open in a way that suggested something had shifted internally, something that could not be undone by a single acknowledgement. "Do you know why?" he asked, and this time, the question did not carry authority, it carried accountability, because whatever answer came next would not define her, it would define the system he had built. Maya held his gaze, steady as ever, and for the first time, there was the faintest trace of something beneath her calm, not resentment, not frustration, but awareness, the kind that comes from having lived through something enough times to recognize its pattern without needing it explained. "No," she said, and then after a brief pause, she added, "But I learned not to wait for explanations." The words were not sharp, they were not defensive, but they carried a quiet truth that settled deeper than anything else that had been said that evening, because they revealed not just what had happened, but how she had chosen to move forward from it. Ethan absorbed that, not with resistance, but with recognition, because in that single sentence, she had described something his systems had never measured, resilience that did not rely on permission, growth that did not depend on validation, and dignity that did not require acknowledgement to exist. He leaned forward again, slower now, his focus narrowing with a clarity that had replaced every earlier assumption, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that no longer came from position, but from decision. "Then allow me to give you one now," he said, and the room did not react outwardly, but something shifted again, deeper this time, because this was no longer about a test, it was about what came after it, and for the first time that night, the outcome was no longer uncertain, it was inevitable. The words did not rush forward after his offer, they arrived with intention, measured and grounded, because Ethan Caldwell understood now that what stood in front of him was not someone waiting to be chosen, but someone who had already proven she did not need to be. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting flat against the table, not as a display of authority, but as a signal of clarity, and when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the earlier distance, only purpose. "You should have been hired," he said, and the statement was not framed as generosity, not as an opportunity, but as a correction, something that should have happened long before this night ever began. Around them, the room had grown quieter again, not silent, but attentive in a way that suggested everyone present understood they were witnessing something that rarely unfolded this openly, not in places where perception usually dictated outcome. Maya remained still, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, but her attention sharpened, not because she expected anything, but because she recognized the weight of what was being said. Ethan continued, not quickly, not trying to fill space, but choosing each word with a precision that mirrored her own. "And that mistake was not yours," he added, his gaze steady, his tone firm without being forceful, because acknowledgement, when it came without condition, carried more impact than any raised voice ever could. Maya did not respond immediately, and that pause, once again, was not hesitation, it was alignment, the same quiet discipline that had defined every moment of her presence that evening. She had heard offers before, promises, statements that sounded meaningful in the moment but dissolved once the room changed, and she understood the difference between reaction and decision. Ethan seemed to recognize that as well, because he did not rush to fill the silence, he allowed it to exist, knowing that anything worth offering required space to be received on its own terms. "If you are willing," he said after a moment, "I would like to invite you to meet with my executive team, not as a candidate to be evaluated, but as someone we clearly failed to recognize." The distinction was subtle, but it mattered because it shifted the dynamic from selection to accountability, from opportunity to acknowledgement. A few guests at the table exchanged quiet glances, some impressed, some surprised, but none dismissive, because the tone of the moment had moved beyond skepticism into something closer to respect. Maya held his gaze for a fraction longer, not searching for sincerity, but confirming it, because sincerity, like everything else that night, revealed itself not in words alone, but in the way those words were carried. "I appreciate that," she said finally, her voice calm, steady, unchanged in its quiet strength, and she did not add more, did not express excitement or hesitation, because her response did not come from the need to be accepted, it came from the same place that had guided every answer she had given. Ethan nodded once, not expecting more, not requiring it, because for the first time that evening, He was not looking for confirmation. He was accepting what had already been shown. Maya stepped back then, returning to her role with the same composed presence she had always carried, moving through the room not as someone transformed, but as someone finally seen, and that distinction mattered more than anything that had been said. The conversations around the room slowly regained their rhythm, but something had shifted beneath them, something quieter, more permanent, because moments like this did not need to be announced to be understood. And as Ethan watched her move through the space with the same steady confidence she had shown from the beginning, one realization settled in fully, clear and undeniable. That power had never belonged to the one who tested. It had always belonged to the one who remained true when being tested mattered most.